We're here to increase our collective understanding of how great cities are shaped. We believe everyone has a role to play in urban design. This is a space where we can learn from international examples and discuss issues relating to built form, the distinctiveness of cities, and how we feel connected to place. We can be curious and open-minded. We can all learn and grow. So, let's get to it, Geelong.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our 7th instalment in the Designing Geelong webinar series. My name is Jonathan Daly. I'm the Manager of Urban Design and Heritage at the City of Greater Geelong and the City Design Champion. This is an educational webinar series to help demystify how cities are designed, and it's brought to you by the Revitalising Central Geelong partnership between the City of Greater Geelong and the Victorian Government. We want the whole community to be better able to engage in the process of shaping our city, and these webinars are hopefully going to help all of us be able to do that. The format of this webinar is a little bit different to the others. It's going to be a joint 20-minute presentation by our guest speakers, and then followed by a 30-minute Q&A. So please feel free to post questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen during the talk. It is an educational webinar series, so we will focus on questions that improve our understanding of urban design. Please don't forget that the session is being recorded. So today's topic is called We Need to Talk About Density. There are probably few topics in urban design that are so divisive, so important, and so misunderstood. And to help us better understand density, we have two of Australia's leading urban designers. First, we have Leanne Hoddle. Leanne is the founder and managing director of Hoddle & Co., a research and urban design consultancy focused on creating cities people love. Leanne has 20 years experience delivering a wide range of projects, including urban renewal, housing, arts and infrastructure strategies, and public realm projects. Our company has recently launched a not-for-profit initiative called Cities People Love, which creates and curates urban research that can engage and empower communities and influence policy and practice. And I urge you to go and check that out. And Leanne is joined today by Catherine Sunderman. Catherine is an associate director at MGS Architects, leading master plan projects for universities, creative employment areas, and housing precincts. She is also a studio leader at Monash University, helping inspire the next generation of public interest urbanists. Drawing on her experience working as an architect and urban designer in Australia, Germany, and the Netherlands, Catherine is passionate about creating more diverse and inclusive neighbourhoods. So over to Leanne.
I think Leanne is muted, but what she'll be trying to say is that I'm going to start the presentation.
Over to Catherine.
Yes. Yeah, we thought, as Jonathan mentioned, it's a slightly different format. We thought that to make the best use of those 20 minutes that we would do a joint presentation. So I'll be very much setting up the context for what is density and why is a certain amount of density important. And then Leanne will talk more about how do we actually enable that density. So I will share my screen, but firstly, thanks so much to Jonathan from the City of Greater Geelong for this opportunity, and thanks to Nikki as well for that incredible welcome to country. So we need to talk about density. I love the way that this question is framed because, as Jonathan said, it is such a hot topic, one that's divisive, and I think density does have quite negative connotations in Australia, and so I'd really like to unpack why that is and perhaps whether we need to rethink that association. And so I think the suburbs, you know, the Australian dream, it's what we're all used to, it's where a lot of us have grown up, and it's something that has really been a strong part of our identity. And what we've seen in recent years is that there's been almost a hyper-intensification of some inner urban areas with some quite poor outcomes as well. So these seem to be the two things that are on offer. Do we want to take the very low density suburban area, or would we prefer to live in a hyper-dense area in the centre of the city? And I think the conversation today is about, well, is it really those two extremes, or is there something in between? Is there an ability to look at more that kind of mid-rise scale of density, both in terms of how we live and work, and what are the benefits of that in terms of being close to friends, close to shops, close to services, close to public transport, and also parks and those other things? Are there benefits in terms of this way of living? And so the structure today is that we really talk again about this idea of density in Australia and how we got to this position. Then I'll take you through some of the benefits of increased density. And finally, as I mentioned, Leanne will talk about how do we actually enable good density. And so as a starting point, I've taken some examples from around the world and using this metric of people per hectare in terms of how we measure density. And you can see that a lot of the examples we see in Europe tend to have a higher amount of people living per hectare. And I think from these examples, you'll see that it's not necessarily a hyperdense or a poor outcome. So we do typically have quite a low density globally, and it's really interesting to unpack that. And so I think whenever we have any conversation about the built environment, it's really important to mention that we are on unceded land, and that Indigenous Australians have had a 60,000-year relationship with country and had this real kind of custodianship and ways of living on land that were really much more about an active management of that. So this last 200 years, really kind of quite a small component, but obviously one that's had a massive impact on how our built environment has been shaped. And the starting point of when Europeans did come to Australia was, if you can imagine kind of Georgian London, that there was this place of hyper density, of having slums and the spread of disease, a lot of those kind of negative elements that we might associate with density. And so certainly when these settlers came to Australia, there was this sense of, well, it was actually kind of government policy to spread out as much as possible, to have these wide streets, to have the detached house, and also that idea of reaching out and settling as much land as possible to kind of keep it for the Great Britain. And so we've had, this is part of our kind of emerging identity, with this idea of spreading out and claiming larger areas of land and really trying to avoid that kind of negative associations with urban living. And then what I think is actually even a greater element is just the time that our cities were created. So obviously Australian cities have grown mostly in the second half of the 20th century, where cars have really been the way that we move around, compared to a lot of the cities that you'll see in Europe, such as this example from Copenhagen, which were designed for people to walk and to experience it in that way. And so you can see that it actually quite really affects the type of development and density that you have if you're designing for a car, where you can travel quite quickly versus how being able to walk. And so we're starting to see the benefits of that more walkable environment. And I think it's interesting to reflect that it certainly was the Australian dream to have a detached house on a block, but this dream is maybe not what it used to be. In that this example on the left used to be like, for a young couple could quite easily afford to purchase and build a house, often quite a modest house on a larger lot, that was quite close to the existing more denser walkable urban area. And so there were some, it really was our housing policy at the time, and one that served us quite well up until recently. And you'll see on the left that there's still very much government policy to give first home buyers. Really, we know that in Geelong, that first home buyers do get stamp duty concessions for taking up these greenfield development sites. So that's really where they're pushed to live. And why it's affordable to buy in the first place. Is it affordable in terms of how you live there longer term? And is it the same environment as this example on the left, in that it's often quite a large house with air conditioning on a much smaller lot, so it doesn't have those benefits that suburban living used to have. And this great quote up the top from James Howard Kunstler: "Suburbia is one of the greatest misallocation of resources the world has ever known." And so that quote's really talking about how, if you think about areas like Whittlesea that have quite a lot of suburban development, what they've found is that they actually make a deficit every year because they don't have enough rate base to actually fund the maintenance of those suburbs over time. So, for example, they really discourage the planting of trees because they don't have the ability to maintain them. So obviously, if you're spreading people out, there's just not that ability to really provide significant infrastructure to support the people that live there. So while it's affordable in the first instance, is it affordable over time? And this is some research that RMIT University did, and actually spoke to a lot of people that live in outer suburban areas. And this example here talks about how, you know, that this woman who, that essentially if you don't have the ability to drive, then you can really be quite isolated. And so in this instance, she was driving her husband 2 hours to work every day, and she had this real concern about what would happen if she was unable to drive anymore. And I've certainly heard of other examples where you might have a couple that are both highly educated, but once they move to an outer suburban area, find that both of them can't really work given the 2-hour commute. So it means that it's really kind of impacting on that couple in terms of their ability to participate in the workforce. So these are really important things that we need to be thinking about when we think about density and whether this is still the way that's the Australian dream. And so what are the benefits of density? I love this phrase from Gilly Giles Cordy from, again, RMIT University, how she talks about delightful density. And she defines that as being close to shops, businesses and services, and being able to get around by walking and cycling. And I would certainly add public transport to that list as well. And so, you know, certainly from living in an environment like that myself, I really see the benefits of having those things close by. And I think it's important to mention that living more densely is actually better for our health. And so I was certainly quite surprised to see that the Health Foundation themselves have actually set up a guide called the Healthy Active by Design Guide, which really steps out the benefits of this creating more kind of connected and walkable neighbourhoods and having things within that kind of 20-minute radius that you can have everything that you need nearby. And so obviously the benefits of that is that you're having more of an active lifestyle, which we all know can have a major effect on our, you know, our lifespan over time. But of course, living more densely is better for the environment as well. So the examples on the left, you're really kind of reducing the loss of ecosystem and of farmland if you do build more densely. But also people who live in cities do tend to have a lower carbon lifestyle. So obviously being able to get around by cycling and walking, using public transport really does limit your environmental impact, and also it's much easier to heat and cool an apartment than it is a detached house. So there's some of the reasons why it's better for the environment. But importantly, it's also better for our prosperity. So we know that if you think about major metropolitan and urban centres, there's much more kind of exchange of ideas. So you have that ability to have that critical mass of businesses that are together that really boosts the kind of options that people have in terms of where they work and improves kind of productivity. But on the other side, there was an example of the cost of infrastructure as well, that obviously there's greater public expenditure if you're needing to really spread out and provide those services over a larger area. And it's interesting to look at some global examples, such as this one from the Netherlands, where it's part of planning policy to actually create more density where there is an existing urban centre, where there is existing public transport. And so both in terms of workplaces and living, just have that higher density in those right places, right down to those kind of more, those areas that are less well connected are better saved for farmland and for, you know, industry and also other car-based elements like having more lifestyle properties, etc. So really making sure we think about where we put density in the right place. And so it's interesting to then reflect on Geelong. So this is a walk score map of Geelong, and I think this would resonate with those of you who do live in Geelong. But obviously if you're in those more central areas, you can kind of walk around quite easily and have even education and work and shops kind of all nearby. and alongside the beautiful foreshore and the Barwon River. But if you're in those, Armstrong Creek is actually off the map, but that's obviously doesn't have all of those services as well. So can we think about these existing areas? Do they have capacity to actually increase the density in these areas? But I think importantly, how do we do that in the right way? Because we've all seen examples of where it's been done in the wrong way, but how do we make sure that we're able to increase the density, but also really kind of respect the Indigenous and European histories of the site, respect the existing built form character, make sure we're getting sunlight to those footpaths, make sure we're getting the views of the bay. How do we make sure that those are all considered if we're thinking about increasing the density of those areas that are already well served? So I think that's a good point to hand over to Leanne, because she'll be taking you through a bit more of how we actually achieve the right kind of density.
Great, thank you very much, Catherine. I'd also just like to thank Jonathan and the team for the invitation to come along today. Catherine and I really enjoyed putting this together, and it's one of our favourite topics, I think it's fair to say, is talking about density. And so as Catherine said, I'm going to focus on how do we deliver good density. I'll just share my screen. Right. So importantly, there's no silver bullet. Oops, I've gone one too far. There's no silver bullet to how we deliver good density. There's no sort of single solution. What we need, and we're keen for everyone to understand, is actually that doing density well is about successfully managing the relationship between the building and the design and scale of that building and its context. And that includes its context to the street, to other buildings that are immediately adjacent, to the broader neighbourhood and to the broader environment. What I'm going to show you next is a few different examples of the way density is managed at different scales. Catherine's touched on the fact that we've got these quite two extreme examples of density in Australia, very low scale and very high scale, and this importance for investigating a kind of middle density. But importantly, we need to be able to deliver good designed environments at all of the different scales. It's not about just saying there's one single solution. So what you see on the screen here is an example from Stirling in Perth of the transition of a traditional suburban area, as Catherine's explained, that was sort of developed in the second half of the 20th century, which had smaller houses on large blocks, which meant there was lots of green space, a lot of tree coverage, and so on. And you can see on this aerial how that's transitioned over time. So what you've got on the right is almost 30 years later, and a lot of those lots have been subdivided into multi-unit developments. So it's low scale in the sense that it's single story, sometimes two-story buildings, but you can see the drastic impact that it's had on the environment in that area. And so you've lost a lot of the green space. There are no longer backyards, which means it's had significant impact on the environment and biodiversity of that area. So this is an example of what we would say is density done poorly in that low scale environment. If we then move to an inner urban environment where we often get multi-story buildings in the order of say 4, 6, or even up to say 10 stories, it's also important to understand how we do this scale well, and it can be done poorly and it can be done really well. And so the example you can see on the screen there on the left is a photograph that was taken in Footscray. It's a 6-story building, apartment building. In some ways, it looks like it's actually fine. For example, the windows that you can see here and balconies look like they have great access to daylight and sunlight and a view. But this building is actually designed to cover the whole, or almost the whole lot, which means that there's hardly any space around the building. And what's actually going to happen is a development's going to go up adjacent to this, and it's actually going to block the amenity that all of those residents enjoy. So they're going to lose their access to daylight, sunlight, and views. It's also a really, it operates on a first in, first dress basis. So the adjacent developer is actually going to have to somehow try and design a building that does protect some of that amenity. But the way the planning controls work at the moment is that they're not supporting that sort of coordinated development outcomes. So we're getting very high densities and eroded quality of environment over time. By contrast, what you see on the right is again a 6-story building, but it's a quite different building. And these apartments are designed so that they have 2 interfaces to the outside areas. So they look out over a park in one direction and a courtyard, internal courtyard in the other direction. That supports much more sustainable development because you can get breezes through, you can get good access to sunlight and natural daylight. And importantly, they're not going to be built out. So this is a resilient type of housing design too that actually will be a great place to live over many, many, many decades compared to the one on the left. You can also see obviously that architectural quality is higher in terms of the selection of materials and the thoughtfulness that's gone into how the building design is expressed. And then even in high density, very, very high density environments in the central city, we still need to be thinking about how do we deliver good environments and high quality environments. The example on the left is from Southbank in central Melbourne. It's a really poor response to what is a heritage building that was sitting on this site. All that's kept to the heritage building is the skin, the outside skin wall. So there's no connection now to what that building was really used for in the past. Sitting on top of that is a car park, a multi-storey car park, which is a very wasteful use of land in the central city. And it's also just a really ugly and not very attractive interface. And above that, a very large apartment building, which may have great views, but isn't that sustainable and is also built quite close to other buildings. So some of those that amenity won't be protected. There's significant challenges with building at this scale around, for example, keeping sunlight to streets and parks and managing wind impacts. What you see on the right is also a high-rise development. So this is a beautiful plaza that's being created. It's in New York, and it's sitting underneath this tower, an 88-story tower that's been designed. It's very sunny, it's very well used. What's in the base of the tower is actually a primary school, so it's great to have this public space associated with that. When I was there were lots of kids playing in the water play features, toddlers waiting for their parents to pick up the older siblings. So it was just a really well-designed building, and it was in the base of a tower. So some of the things the key thing we really need to think about in all of these different scales as well is the importance of streets and public spaces, because that's actually where most of us experience and engage with all of these buildings. We're obviously not all living in all of them, but we're really engaging with them through moving through these streets and spaces. And so what you can see on the screen here is some bad examples on the left. These are examples taken from the Melbourne Design Guide, which talks about the importance of how to really consider the delivery of good design as both a process and an outcome. And there's examples on the left you can see undercroft spaces. They're not very well lit, they're not very well overlooked, so they feel unsafe. And they're really blank edges or services and utilities that are built at the edges, so they're really unengaging. Whereas on the right, you have a really delightful example. It's a donut shop and coffee shop in Melbourne, and the thoughtfulness that you can see here has created a really different experience for the people on the street. So there's a seat built into the edge, the windows open up, air circulates between the inside and outside, and you can really see into the building, so it's really engaging and creates a safe street. So what we also want to share with you today is how we actually manage this, because we can all talk about the great principles and the great outcomes we're trying to deliver, but importantly, we actually have to be able to manage the delivery of private development to deliver this. And most of our development is on private land. And so a lot of the work that we do is actually looking at, well, how do we give good guidance to deliver these good design outcomes at all those different scales. So what you can see on the screen here is the traditional approach that's in place across most of Victoria, where we manage density or the scale of a building by managing a building envelope, what's called a building envelope. And so that typically includes the management of a building height. And we know lots of people are really passionate about the heights of buildings, and sometimes there's a lot of resistance to tall buildings because they're seen as poor development. And this approach does focus on height quite a lot. And then often out of that potential building height is carved out building setbacks. So these are areas of the building that have to step away from the street or from side or rear boundaries. You can see those shown in the pink there, which is intended to give to support some of that outlook to views and also support the access to natural daylight, sunlight and ventilation. What often happens though is these controls are set in place the expectation of the developer and the landowner then is that they can build to fill this envelope, which means there's a lot of pressure, and particularly as land values increase, is to really make sure that they fill this envelope so they can sell as much development as possible, and actually make the development stack up. And as land values go up, there's more pressure to put more and more yield on each site. So this has served us with mixed results, I would say, across Victoria, but there are more sophisticated and better ways to think about how we manage building design. So an alternate approach, which is common in many other locations, it's recently been introduced into the central city of Melbourne, but it operates in New South Wales and many other jurisdictions, is to actually more directly manage density. If density is the problem and we have to make sure that density is done well, then actually we shouldn't be talking about envelopes. We should actually be talking about the actual amount of development that's on a specific site. And so this, you may have heard this term, it's a density control, which is sometimes called a floor area ratio control or a plot ratio control. But instead of just managing how big the building can be by managing its sort of extremities and how its overall envelope, we actually start to say, well, how much floor space should be in each building on each site? So this little diagram here is drawn on the same size site as the previous one, but what I've done here is actually shown a taller building. So it's now an 8-story building, not a 6-story building, but it has the potential to be a much better designed building and the potential to deliver a lot of the benefits that Catherine was talking you through. So some of those I've captured on the screen here. So they include things like better walkability. So because the building now has more space around it, there's the opportunity to include new laneways that can improve walkability and connections. We've now got potential to include more space around the building to support green space, so play space or recreational space, more larger canopy trees, which supports biodiversity and cools the environment. We've got building separation, which supports sunlight and daylight coming into those buildings and which actually protects. If it's separated enough, those buildings will retain that access to those that great quality of environment. It also supports cross ventilation because you've got smaller building footprints, so you can get apartments that front both facades and actually can open up windows and support breezes coming through to naturally cool the building. And as Catherine said, higher density development can also deliver economic benefits. So things like having more frontages and more active streets, some of those donut shops that I showed you earlier, it just creates more opportunities for those kind of spaces. And there'll be the scale of people to support that sort of density, that sort of retail environment as well. So to conclude, it's really important to think about the many scales that we can deliver density at, and that delightful density can be delivered at many scales, but it has to be done well and done thoughtfully. And that the focus should really be on the outcomes that are sought for the area. So the character, the quality of the housing, the workplaces and the public spaces, and particularly the quality of those places for many, many decades to come, and the broader social, environmental and economic benefits that can be delivered through density done well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you, Catherine, for a fantastic presentation. You've taken us through so much in a short period of time, so much to unpack, and yeah, just to be able to do that in a short space of time is very impressive. So thank you very, very much. We are going to open up to questions. So if you haven't already done so, please drop us some questions in the Q&A. But I've got a couple to at least to get us started. I guess the obvious issue is the situation that we're currently living in under COVID, and I think we've heard a lot about the apparent demise of cities and the end of cities, and Melburnians fleeing the city to regional areas and so on, which is some of that is obviously very beneficial. We could do with a little bit of decentralization, but at the same time, we've had pandemics before, and we've kept urbanizing. So there's no reason that density is not going to be a part of our future. But I'm interested in what both of you think in terms of, what impact will COVID have on how we design our cities in the future?
I can jump in if you want. I don't know if you want to. Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan. It's a great question, and I agree. I don't think we're going to see the death of the city. I think cities will survive for the same reasons they've always survived through past pandemics as well, because of all the benefits that they bring. I think what's really interesting, reflecting on last year and the sort of experience that different people had, was the quality of their living environment became really obviously central if everyone was working from home or stuck at home. And for a lot of the people I talked to, friends and colleagues, that was quite diverse. And so it really sort of brought to home the importance of having really good places to live, that you do have access to some green space near you, that you have enough space in your apartment so that you can have a place to work. So I think I'm hoping that the longer term benefit will be actually to support better designed living environments and also working environments. We now know that there's going to be a real push for more green spaces and outdoor spaces in working environments as well. So I'm optimistic that the long-term benefits will be really positive, because the quality of our environments was shown up to us last year, and some people had much better experiences than others.
Yeah, so healthier buildings, healthier public spaces, and I guess that that you were touching on controls that protect the amenity of public realm, protecting sunlight and so on. They're going to become even more important in the future.
That's right. I think firstly I want to apologise for the sound in the background. I don't know if you can hear it, but because of my denser urban environment, I do have a construction site next door. But yeah, I think it's really, I think you've really touched on something very important, Leanne, in terms of it's been a bit of a wake-up call to make sure if we are building denser urban environments, how can we make sure that they're extremely livable? And I think your examples that you showed, Leanne, showed that in Victoria we have had a kind of a real focus on thinking about density just in terms of how you experience it from the outside. So as you were saying with that Footscray example, it might not look too different to the one next to it, but from an internal perspective, it's hugely different. And that's how the people that live there actually experience it. And I think that I certainly look to the New South Wales planning controls. So they're actually updating them at the moment. It's now becoming known as the Design and Place SEP. And I'd encourage, and obviously there's the ADG within it that actually looks at apartment design. And I'd encourage those who are involved in the built environment industry to have a look at those, because they're introducing new ones such as mandatory common space on the ground floor, so kind of more shared uses for the residents there. But an interesting COVID reflection as well is that 2-bedroom apartments now need to be, the bedrooms need to be separate from each other, acoustically separate. And I think you can see that that's really about that idea of people working at home as well and having that acoustic separation. So I think really, in Victoria, we have had that focus on what an apartment looks like from the outside, but can we really ramp up the amenity of that apartment from the inside? And we certainly are making inroads in that we've got the Better Apartment Design Standard that's again being updated at the moment. So how can we continue to make sure that we're doing density well in that way? I think from a more macro approach in terms of that idea of decentralisation, and we know that I know that Geelong's been affected, that all these Melburnians are coming and ruining your prices of housing. So apologies, but that there has been that push, but over the entire century we know that that actually it kind of rebounds, people come back, that there's just so many benefits from living in an urban environment. And interestingly, the number one is jobs. I actually was working on a project in Ballarat, and we were working with SGS Economics, and they said that the kind of tree change normally lasted about 3 years. So that people would move to a place like Ballarat, there'd be the sense that both partners in a couple would try and find work there. Typically, one of them would be working for themselves, and the other one would try and find work there and not be able to. And so they would end up having to commute back to Melbourne. And after a year and a half of doing that, they couldn't handle it anymore. And it took them another year and a half to sell that property and move back to an urban area, so to Melbourne. And so this hopefully can be shifted slightly through that greater focus on flexible working, that in places like, but it's just kind of a real lesson for places like Geelong, that it needs to not be a dormitory to Melbourne, but actually have, and I know that's already happening, building up the kind of government jobs that are in Geelong, starting to look at the other types of employment that can be really, so that Geelong operates in its own right. But that kind of it sounds really obvious, but having a place to work is so crucial to make that work.
Thanks, Leanne and Catherine. We've got lots of really great questions coming in, so I'm just going to pick some out at random for you, and we'll try and work our way through most of them. So we've got one from Gail Armstrong. I like your term delightful density. I wonder if design for good quality density needs to accommodate the opposite to density, which is vacancy. Good high density can be delivered, but can delightful density address the negative impacts of long-term underutilized buildings with sit adjacent to high density development? It's a big question. If I can paraphrase it in a shorter version, I think what Gil's asking is what role can high density play in terms of addressing some of the vacant buildings that might exist in a city?
In the city, I'm assuming they're in the city right now. I'm not sure if that's a post-COVID kind of question as well.
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's a real opportunity with the vacancy rates in the city now to actually regenerate the city in a much more interesting and vibrant way. So I've been living in Melbourne CBD for 15 years and I've seen it transition quite a lot, get more and more dense, but also getting a little bit, I have to be careful because I'm getting recorded. I don't want to be quoted on dissing Melbourne CBD, but also getting a little bit the same. I was going to say, like some of the diversity has been lost, and as sort of bigger organisations take up more floor space, and the retail's gotten a lot less diverse. We've lost a lot of the makers out of our city. We had a lot of making spaces. So I'm really, again, quite encouraging and really would love to see government take a proactive role in trying to bring some of those makers back and take advantage of the fact that we've got vacant spaces and turn it into a really amazing positive story.
No, I completely agree. It's interesting. I live in Fitzroy, and I've seen this neighbourhood completely lose its diversity as well, both in terms of having people from different income groups, but also having those other uses, those, as you say, the maker spaces, the creative offices, they're all gone. It's just become a kind of really monocultural area. And so I think what both the things we're talking about is just starting to see that importance of really providing mechanisms for affordable housing, but also affordable workplace. So how can those be encouraged? And there certainly are ways of doing that. It's always difficult, but that, again, kind of, could there be some sort of program to make use of those vacant spaces, but for a reduced rate? And I know that, for example, in Geelong, there's a lot of vacant ground floor, like vacant shops. How could those shops be used for creative spaces as well, in order to kind of bring people back to the city?
Thanks. We've got another, I think, really interesting question from Brendan McRae. So Brendan's asking, what's the current economic narrative about this level of density? He's saying so many planners want 4, 6, 8 stories, but get pushed back and because there's an apparent need for 10 plus. He's asking what's the counter narrative to that?
I certainly have one. It's interesting because I've been working a lot with development economist, which, you know, at the start of my career, I didn't think that's what I'd be doing, but I found that that's actually really crucial to kind of understand how that all works and to have that data, because there's a lot of misinformation that goes around. And I think if you speak to a lot of landowners or speculative developers, they'll say, you know, these heights are way too low. You know, why is it only 6 stories? Like, it needs to be 20 or 30 stories. And I think if you think about more regional centres or, you know, areas like Frankston or Dandenong and things like that, if you put in those very high heights, you will get architects and developers developing schemes and putting in planning applications for those projects. But will they go ahead is the other question. So you see a lot of speculation, but not a lot of actual development, which means that you're not actually getting those people living and working in those areas. And so often, unless you're in the centre of Melbourne, those heights of the kind of 6 to 8 stories are actually much easier to develop. And certainly it gives developers a lot more certainty if there is kind of you know, mandatory heights in place, or a lot more clarity about what height or density you can achieve. And I know that, for example, Nightingale Housing, who've delivered a lot of great housing in Melbourne, but also Ballarat, and I know they're working on a project as well in Adelaide and other places. They only situate their projects in neighbourhoods that have those lower height controls. And so certainly from a economic perspective, it makes a lot of sense to look at those lower heights, because if you're the developer, you can, it's much easier to sell those 20 apartments than it is to sell 80 apartments, for example.
Mm. Leanne, would you like to add to that?
No, I agree with what Catherine said. I think there is a really strong counter narrative about that. And often in the processes that I've been in where that narrative is put forward that it's not feasible, there's very little evidence that's been put forward to back it up. So if there is that evidence, we'd love to see more of it, but I don't think that that's always the case.
Mm. Thanks. We move on to another question. I think it's a really good question here from Nathan Islip. How can we reverse engineer open space into existing suburbia when the cost to do so prevents government acquisition and developers are focused on maximizing yield?
Well, I guess first I'd also jump in and say, I think what COVID showed us is if government wants to spend money, it can choose to spend the money. So we often do start with the sort of premise that government can't spend the money. And I know, having said that, though, I know a lot of councils are particularly impacted by COVID and have difficult financial situations. But I think at a bigger picture, though, we invest government money in what we value. So if we actually value that open space and think that that's our priority, I'm pretty sure we'll find a solution for it. But I guess in the suburban examples that are included, for example, in the latest designing homes competition and some of the sort of just examples I gave at the end of my presentation, if the controls can actually require some of that open space, that's actually just a really simple and direct way to deliver it. But it has to be put in place from the beginning. You can't kind of try and carve it out at the end.
Yeah, just before Catherine jumps in there, could I, so Nathan asked about suburbia. How can we do that in the central city?
Well, the principles that I've just mentioned are the same in terms of actually making a decision that that's actually what you want to deliver and focusing on it. I think the mechanisms that we've looked at in the central city, for example, recently in Melbourne Central City or in Fisherman's Bend or others, are to identify in the strategic design work that's being done the suitable locations for those new open spaces, and then actually to pair that with controls that support the delivery of those open spaces. But if so therefore that work has to be very clear, and that policy work has to be very clear that there's an expectation that those spaces will be part of the delivery mechanism through either a cash contribution if you set a higher open space contribution for developers, for example, or through use of something like a density control. But it has to be done early, otherwise you're just fighting in a rearguard battle and developers will feel like they've lost something by delivering open space.
Are there? Do you know of any really clever ways that open space has been provided in sort of medium, higher density developments? You know, where you don't, in cases where you don't have land available to convert to open space. Is there any kind of clever ways?
Well, I guess that's what I'm talking about, is it actually designed the controls to say that the development has to deliver some of that open space on their site. Yeah. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I was thinking about I know we always talk about Copenhagen, but they did introduce a control that required all developments to provide open space in the central city, and it led to very innovative ways where you get a public park on top of a medium density housing development that was accessible 24/7 and to everyone.
Yeah.
You know, can we be a little bit more clever, maybe?
Yeah, that's right. And I think to take that, you know, if we're talking about parks, is it only about parks or it is about urban greening in general, if we think about denser urban areas? And so a great example is in Singapore. About 20 years ago, they introduced something called Lush. And so that's actually essentially each building, when it gets developed, needs to give back that same amount of green open space as the plot that it's sitting on. And so there's a number of ways you can do that, and you get more points if you provide actual deep soil areas where you can plant trees in the ground, versus you get less points if it's on the facade or a rooftop garden. And so this mechanism has been extremely successful in Singapore, and it's actually generated a whole industry around delivering kind of urban greening. And obviously it has all these flow-on benefits in terms of people's health and also biodiversity, but it's also brought down the cost of those things because you've got this whole industry built around it. And we're hoping to see the same thing in Melbourne, because actually the City of Melbourne have been working on something called Green Factor. So that's very much similar to the Lush model. And so all new development will need to include urban greening as well. And so, as I was saying, often it will be easier for the developers to meet that requirement by providing it on the ground, which obviously has the most benefit. So that's kind of one. And I think it's interesting to look at in terms of inner urban areas, as Leanne's saying, like just planning for it in advance. Certainly if there's any rezoning that needs to take place, I think that was the big lesson from Fisherman's Bend, in that the whole area was rezoned with no parks identified. And so then the City of Melbourne had to buy back at great expense little pockets of green to deliver their open space, which is obviously not how we should be doing things. And I think in a similar way, because you were talking about political will, in Brunswick, they've had to do something similar in that they've just bought really expensive blocks of land that are ripe to be developed into apartments and turn them into parks, because there was so much demand from the local residents to do so. But I think almost a kind of more strategic version is to just make use of what we have. So I think the City of Melbourne are particularly good at this. Like if you look at their West Melbourne plan, they've thought about the entire street as being potential open space and started consolidating where the road is on one side so that you can have these linear parks. Of course, thinking about if we have any on-grade car parking, can that become a park? So thinking about, you know, all the public area, including roads and car parking, what can become green open space. So that's making better use of what we have. And I think that if we kind of go back to the original question, which was about the suburbs, and I think that's a really interesting one. And I think I love this example from Western Australia, where they started to look at everyone's front yard and how that could be used more communally as a common space. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name of that project, but I thought that was really clever. And in a similar way, are there ways that we can start looking at roads and closing them to vehicles and turning them into open spaces? But I think the major issue that suburban areas have, we were already mentioned today about just not, you know, where is this investment coming from? There's not enough. It's not like Brunswick, where there's enough people living there that you can actually justify local government buying land and turning it into a park. So I think it's almost up to the community members themselves to think strategically about taking over spaces that might be underused. And then also, as Leanne was saying, if there are controls put in place for kind of intensifying those areas in terms of the amount of people living there, how can that be done in a way that makes sure there's lots of open space as part of that? And there have been small inroads in that we now have something called green area in suburban areas. I think it's green areas.
Garden.
So that, what's it called?
Garden.
Garden area. And so garden area means that it's really changed the way, for example, townhouse developments are delivered, because now it doesn't make sense to have a driveway with like a separate entrance for each townhouse. It makes sense to have consolidated parking, which frees up the site to have more green or garden area. So I think those kind of mechanisms are so important, and something that we need to do to avoid that example that Leanne showed of just having units covering the entire site.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned about the community and what the community can do, and I'm going to use that to segue into, there's a really good question from Christopher Leon. He's asking, to what extent can we utilize civic participation in the design and planning future growth of, for density?
I think we should absolutely be doing this. I mean, obviously there's a shift at the moment in Victoria to really support deliberative democracy processes in the preparation of council sort of long-term strategies. We're working on a project at the moment, which is a deliberative democracy panel in near Port Phillip on a public realm project, which has just been fantastic, because there's a community panel set up, which is 28 people who represent their community, who are debating and discussing what this new boulevard, how it should be designed and what it could deliver, so that it delivers benefit for that area as it does get more intensified. It's a fantastic process, because you just tap into so many different voices and perspectives, different age groups. People have different levels, different mobility, different cultural backgrounds and needs. I think we're just getting started, I think, on that. I'm doing that well here. It's done well elsewhere.
Definitely. And I think there's so much scope for that, because, compared to elected officials, the average citizen, if they're representative of their group, they're actually going to make, if they're given all of the right information, they make really kind of altruistic decisions about what's better for the entire neighbourhood, and often they're able to make much more kind of radical changes and decisions than elected officials are, because they've given the remit to actually do that. And so that's something that we need to do more of. And I think there's a great example from about 20 years ago in Vancouver, that they had a situation, they actually had that kind of deliberative process at a city scale, and they had a huge amount of community involvement. And their big challenge at the time is similar to issues that we're facing in Australia, in that they had, well, not right now, but they had huge amounts of migration. They needed to add a lot of people to the existing cities. And so they broke the entire city into a series of districts, and then said, well, would you like to take these additional citizens? Where could they go? Where should that increased density be? But they gave them a real trade-off and said, well, if you welcome this increased density, you'll also get significant investment in your infrastructure and your open space and all of those things. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprising, but surprisingly, a lot of those neighbourhoods said, yes, please, actually we want to have those new residents coming in. We want to have the increased density because we know it's going to make our neighbourhood better as a whole. So I think really giving people those trade-offs and really showing the benefits. And so I think some of those things that Leanne mentioned in terms of having developer contributions for public realm upgrade is just so important, because it's crazy when you walk around neighbourhoods and see this shiny new apartment building and then the cracked pavement next to it and the lack of open space. I think that's something that we already know the mechanisms. Let's make sure they're put in place so that we get that investment in the public spaces as well. Seeing all that investment not just going into private hands, but also upgrading the neighbourhood as a whole.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think your comment, Catherine, about It's not the way we've done community engagement in the past has often been to say, we've got a solution,
Mm.
here it is, and then it puts a lot of the designers or the government people who are managing it into this defend position. We've got a solution, we're now defending it, whereas actually what is a much better outcome is this, Catherine's just given a fantastic example, is to say, help us solve the problem. We have there are benefits of increased population. How can we harness them? And do you want them in your area? And how do we do it well?
Absolutely. We've got another question. It's actually the first question that we got through. I'm struggling to keep up here, but it's a really good question. It is about Geelong and about the ambition to have more people living in the centre. Obviously, lots of people lived in central Geelong back in the day, but then went to the suburbs, and now we're trying to encourage more people back. And Simon's asking the question: is the ambition of 12,000 residents enough? I think that's a difficult one to answer, but I might, if Simon is okay with it, I might flip that a little bit to ask, how do we encourage that? How do we provide the right kind of built form in the central city that attracts people back into the centre to live?
Well, I mean, I think at a very fundamental level, you obviously have to make living in the centre a really attractive proposition. So then it's about saying, well, what makes it an attractive proposition? And it's obviously having a really a good lifestyle. It's a really walkable environment. You don't have to get into a car and get stuck in traffic. You have access to great cultural and social life, access to the waterfront. Like, there's obviously amazing reasons to move in there. So then it's, why aren't people moving in there? Is it that the housing stock isn't actually meeting their needs because they have a family and the apartments are poorly designed, or there's no balcony, or there's no open space on some of the more, say, maybe lower scale developments. So I think it's really about learning from other cities and how that's done well and how it has attracted people into those areas.
You've touched on a few things. Sorry, Catherine, before we go to you, I just want to ask Leanne, it picks up on probably 3 or 4 other questions in here around, there's questions about the quality of apartments, and we've certainly seen, a lot done really poorly. And then there's also questions around, the typologies of residential development that we see. Does it all have to be sort of towers, or what else is there, that we can do in the central city?
So Kath and I both obviously interested in what's happening in Geelong, and have looked at it a little bit. So I absolutely think it doesn't have to be all towers. There should be a housing diversity as part of that offer. So it can be from sort of 3 or 4 stories. But towers can also have their place if they're done well. Like, lots of people choose to live in towers. We shouldn't sort of demonize them. If you deliver a well-designed tower, it can be a great place to live. But it doesn't suit everybody. In fact, the evidence shows that most high-rise apartments suit people for a certain period of their life. It suits extroverts. So there's some really interesting studies into sort of the psychology of what makes living in a tower enjoyable. So I think we need a range of housing options
I think that in terms of typology, it comes back to that stat that was mentioned earlier about this current target of 12,000 people living in central Geelong. So if we started to build a whole lot of residential towers in Geelong, you'd eat through that target pretty quickly. And again, you have those issues as well in terms of the development feasibility of actually being able to sell enough of those apartments to get it off the ground. So certainly from a development perspective, having that certainty to know that, I'm, as a developer, I'm, trying to, I'm not going to pay too much for the land if I only want to build that kind of 6 to 8 stories. And interestingly, there's other elements as well, that if you go over 8 stories, you actually reach a different fire code. And so if you're under 8 stories, you can have open stairwells. You actually don't need as many stairwells. And so it actually reduces the cost as well. So there's kind of a bit of a natural limit there. And also in terms of, just like that kind of, to me, it's kind of a sweet spot because it's actually documented to be a healthier way to live, and that you are more likely to use the stairs if you're kind of a lower rise dwelling. You're more likely to have less people living in the building as well. So you might kind of have that sweet spot of around 20 to 30 apartments in there. So you might actually have a chance of knowing your neighbours, and also just in terms of having that connection to the street as well. You're more likely to be able to see down and see people's faces as you walk past, and have that real connection. So certainly, as someone who lives in a building that's 5 stories tall, I wouldn't live in a building that was taller necessarily. I think it's really important to, it's for me, it's more of a kind of humane level. And I think that there's some things as well in terms of those taller buildings have much more complex mechanical systems that might fail over time, and structural systems, as we've seen with the Opal Tower in New South Wales. So actually, having that more simple kind of lower rise typology has so many benefits. So as I kind of touched on in my presentation, we haven't been good at advocating for that scale in terms of our planning system. So how can we shift that? And I think we've been speaking a lot about kind of the built typology, but then also in terms of the type of developer as well. Also those smaller scale developers that might be more interested in creating a sense of community and delivering more environmental outcomes, they're probably better suited to that scale as well. Was there any kind of other elements to that question? I feel like there were so many elements. How do we encourage people to move in? I think just another really important layer is that affordability element. So obviously we need to provide housing that's affordable for people on kind of low and moderate incomes as well. And we know, for example, that there's been a huge amount of state government investment in public housing announced recently. So there's $5.8 billion. And of that, I don't know the exact figure, but I think it's something like $107 million have been allocated to Geelong. So where are we going to put that housing? That's the question I pose to everyone. Are we going to put it out on the edge of the city and almost increase and intensify that kind of disadvantage of the people that are living there? Or are we going to create the housing actually in the centre of the city where people are close to jobs, where they are able to use public transport and to walk to get those areas, the things that they need? So I think affordable housing is a good way. Since that kind of funding is available, could we not consider having some of that in central Geelong to almost kind of supercharge how people live in the city? And it's interesting as well to see the incredible work that Deacon's been doing. They have a lot of student residences, and they've taken over, for example, that TNG building and turned it into a place for students to live. So we've seen in central Melbourne as well, that students were a big driver in terms of bringing that kind of life and vibrancy to a central city area. So yeah, thinking about who are these people that are going to be living there and how can they be supported, whether it's students, affordable housing, and then those kind of smaller developers as well.
Absolutely. We're out of time. This, honestly, it's such a fantastic subject, and we could go on. And I'm really sorry to all of those people that asked fantastic questions that we couldn't get to. I'm going to come back to one of them that was asked twice in a moment. But first, I want to thank Leanne and Catherine for your presentations and for the Q&A. It really was fantastic, and really appreciate your time today and sharing your knowledge and experience with us. I want to thank everyone that joined in. We had a really big audience today, which was fantastic. And just coming back to, there was a couple of questions about car parking, which is a wonderful segue into our next webinar session, which is called How Car Parking Shapes Cities. So if you join us for the next session, we will answer your question in detail. Take care, everyone. We look forward to seeing you next month. And thank you again, Leanne and Catherine.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your questions. Thanks.